Hey, this PowerPoint will focus a lot about my life, but hopefully through the prism of what I see, you'll be able to understand some aspects of minority ethnic development as well as just the experiences of minority. So race matters. How do you understand race through experience? And in particular, my experience, I already mentioned, I am a psychotherapist in private practice here in the Seattle area. And I focus a lot of my work on what's known as Asian cultural shame, some addiction work, and a number of other multicultural issues. So the goal is to explore our fears and biases in our relationships with multicultural populations. The goal for the entire course, recognizing how race impacts mental health and identity development for ethnic minorities, and understanding how white privilege operates on a systemic level in the United States, whether we're referring to the criminal justice system, educational institutions, recreational, housing. It impacts so many various structures that are built into society. So why does race matter? It's part of America's past, it's part of our present, and it will be a part of our future. Maybe not, hopefully not as much in terms of racial hostility or fear or suspicion, but race as an identity, I think, will always be a component of who we are. So a bit about my journey. I am an Asian immigrant, first generation. Part of my journey involves both me and my two younger brothers and our parents and extended relatives acculturating to the United States. I also, because I come from a Chinese, specifically a Chinese heritage, that carries a lot of cultural aspects deeply embedded that's passed on through the generations. And one aspect is what's known as the honor and shame dynamic. They are two sides of the same coin when it comes to the tension that a lot of Asians navigate when they're here in the United States. I'm going to start it off by reading a spoken word poem. It is titled, My Passport to Pain. My passport to pain. My passport looks wrong, British for nationality, Chinese by ethnicity, living in an American democracy stamped through customs internationally. It's my passport to pain, culture of shame, teased for not being the same. Too Chinese to be American, too American to be Chinese, found solace in my need to please. I put up a mask, a face, also known as a mian in Chinese, to hide myself, hide my pain, hide my shame so no one can see. But God sees me though, through high and low, like Adam and Eve, naked and afraid, stopped when God firmly said, hey, you're redeemed, you're renewed, you're remade. So that spoken word poetry encapsulates a bit of my journey, a little bit more in terms of my background. As I mentioned, I'm specifically Chinese, and I'm an immigrant from Hong Kong. Hong Kong was once a British colony from the 1850s up until 1997 when Hong Kong was transferred back to mainland China. Here I am on the right-hand side. I'm a little toddler there in the mid-70s. I don't remember much about Hong Kong, because our parents moved us here to the United States when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. Here's my dad and I on the beach of Hong Kong. If you've ever been to Hong Kong, it is a very humid place. Very humid all throughout the year. My dad is on the left-hand side. He started in the kitchen and to this day still works as a cook. He got some promotions along the way, and technically he's a chef, but he started working really young and moved his way up. My parents together in Hong Kong. Here is a more traditional wedding picture of my parents. And then the Chinese celebration or the reception. You can see my mom is wearing her Chinese gown. So when we came to America, coming to America oftentimes is viewed as this, obviously it's the land of opportunity and so on and so forth, but people forget that there is culture shock for those who are immigrating here, whether they're immigrating on their own accord or they're leaving because they have to due to political, social unrest, such as those of refugees. Here, I'm on the left-hand side, my two younger brothers on the right-hand side, looking kind of shell-shocked, and I think they knew what was happening. We're coming to America. Part of coming to America is the adjustments that happen along the way and the culture clash, right? Language and communication barriers. My parents moved to the United States, more specifically South Seattle, at a time when they did not know a single word of English. So imagine that. Late 20s, my mom was in her late 20s, my dad was in his early 30s, moving to another country where they didn't understand the language. Not only that, their children, us, we didn't really understand their native tongue, which was Cantonese. And so we're learning English, becoming very proficient in English, and having an inability to communicate with our parents, with the exception of some, I guess, some basic phrases in my parents' Cantonese. Not only that, we also have to deal with larger acculturation issues. Those issues include immigrating here, getting settled, finding an ethnic, or at least for my parents, finding some ethnic support. What does citizenship look like? Because no one was a citizen at the time. My father was sponsored to work here by a Chinese restaurant in Federal Way, which is just south of Seattle by about 20 minutes. So all of this impacts my identity as a Chinese American and also as an ethnic minority within the United States. So there's a piece called the Minority Identity Development that I'll discuss a little further. And along the way, I'm also having to navigate the differences between collectivism versus individualism. This particular presentation, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but collectivist cultures, such as those from East Asian countries, are about group cohesion, group harmony, putting the family and the group first. And that's what's espoused from as young as I could remember. Whereas in Western and American society, we are asked to think for ourselves, to be individualistic, to speak up. And these are very polarizing aspects of how you relate to one another. So we were the majority in Hong Kong, meaning even to this day, statistics bear out that native Cantonese speakers in Hong Kong make up close to 89% of the population in Hong Kong. It may have been much higher when my parents moved in the mid-70s. And then we moved to the United States, where we're clearly an ethnic minority. And not only an ethnic minority, but a minority within a minority culture. In South Seattle, it was a predominantly African American community with a growing Asian community. And this I guess wearing multiple identities was starting to take shape. I knew I was Chinese, at least, you know, in terms of what my parents' heritage. I also recognize that I'm American now. And aspects of being an American within an African American community meant, oh, a part of me was also being shaped by the African American community. So starting to realize, maybe on a very unconscious level, that there were multiple identities starting to give birth, so to speak. When it comes to minority identity development model, some of you may be aware of this. There are 4 stages: the pre-encounter stage, the encounter stage, the immersion stage, and the internalization stage. I won't go too in depth in this, but the pre-encounter stage and the encounter stage, that's probably what made up the majority of my childhood, with the pre-encounter stage where I am not thinking much about my culture and actually trying to dismiss my culture, minimize my culture so I could feel more accepted in America. That's why you see that ethnic self-hatred. I wish I was white, or maybe I wish I was black, since that was the community I was living in. So individuals are programmed to perceive and think of the world as being anti-minority and act in ways that devalue their minority development. The encounter stage, that didn't happen till much later, probably the middle school, high school age, where I really started gaining an awareness of what it meant to feel validated as somebody who came from an Asian background, but also assimilating into the American identity. Immersion stage is when somebody rejects all non-minority values and fully immerse themselves in minority culture. The closest I can recall of me doing something similar to this was when I was in graduate school in Los Angeles. I had a friend, he was a Korean American therapist, and the two of us decided on a lark to move into Koreatown. So we moved into Koreatown. As you know, if you've ever been there, it's pretty self-sustaining, and you don't ever have to leave it. And so that was about as close as I got to being totally immersed in a all-ethnic enclave, so to speak. And then in the internalization stage is when people can feel secure about who they are and navigate between all the different worlds and experiences. Very early on, I mentioned I started realizing I was obviously not white and obviously not black, so my racial filter kicked in. I needed to find a way to minimize who I was so that it wouldn't draw attention. As I mentioned, and one stark example, I think I was like 5 or 6 years old. My grandmother was on the bus. She was talking Chinese to me, and I just couldn't stand it. And I would respond back to her in English, even though she didn't know English, because everybody around me, I just was worried they would look at me or view me as a foreigner if I was speaking back to her in her native Cantonese language. What else made me realize that I was a foreigner? This is an example of a green card, and at the time it said resident alien at the top. So my green card said resident alien, my parents, my brothers, everything said resident alien. So I kept looking at these cards and saying, resident alien, I'm an alien? Like, wow. They've since changed it, so now the name is permanent resident. Speaking of citizenship, I once worked with an Ethiopian client. He was first generation, worked as a medical professional, so had a very good profession, education. But even then, because he wasn't a citizen, he had a lot of shame associated with that until he became a citizen, and he reported this back to me that following week. I had my citizenship ceremony today. It was actually quite emotional, the depth of emotions. It hit me, the shame of not being a citizen, and with coworkers, I would rather not talk about that so I don't correct them necessarily when they assumed I was a citizen. So this just shows how hard it is for immigrants, especially even if they do have permanent resident status. If you're not a citizen, you might still feel, no pun intended, like a second-class citizen. And that's kind of how I felt walking around with a green card until I was 18 years old and could finally apply for my own citizenship. Another aspect that is sometimes glossed over is all the customs that come to living in the United States, right? These great traditions that we have. We'll start on the left side, right? Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the Tooth Fairy. So my wife loves festivities for Easter. She decorated the house. She had little plastic Easter eggs with candy and toys inside for our 4-year-old to open up. And, you know, it was just really fun and joyous. I would see them painting colored eggs, and short of just going to an Easter service, all the festivities is really not my thing because our parents didn't do that. They didn't even know anything about Easter. Thanksgiving, obviously, my parents may have had, we would celebrate Thanksgiving, but instead of a turkey, what do you think we were eating? So a very Chinese traditional, I guess, banquet style meal. It wasn't this bird. We had a different type of bird. It was roast duck. And I know duck is good. It's great, you know, if you've ever had it. It tastes really tasty. But my desire to be American trumped my desire for the roast duck. And me and my 2 younger brothers kept begging and pleading my parents to get us a turkey. And it wasn't until high school they finally broke down and started buying and roasting turkeys. Christmas, there was one Christmas that stood out because that was the year when we had a white neighbor who donated a real Christmas tree to us. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very positive experience for my mom because all she could think about were the pine and complain about were the pine needles that fell off. So that was the one year we had a Christmas tree. So to this day, hanging up lights, mistletoe, tinsel, wreaths. Oh my gosh, it's just so much to do. And the tooth fairy had a very rude awakening because when I had my tooth taken out by the dentist, I must have been 7 or 8, put it underneath my pillow in the middle of the night, woke up the next morning, lifted up the pillow, saw my tooth there, realized there was no tooth fairy. So, you know, it's just something to reflect on where things get lost in translation. So aspects of life that we may take for granted may not actually be a part of some immigrants or refugees or those who are new to this country, especially the first generation families. So what does this all do on one's identity if you're an ethnic minority? As I mentioned, there could be ethnic self-hatred. You heard how I dismissed some of my native language. Name changes, so some people change their names, myself included. I didn't do it. My parents, more specifically my mom, when she moved here, we all had our Chinese name. My real name is Fu Yin Louis. But when my mom moved us here, she asked her only one white friend, what would be 3 good, nice American names for my boys? So the guy said, why don't you choose Sam, Ken, and Fred? So just like that, tic-tac-toe, Sam, Ken, and Fred it was. And there's no full name. It's not Samuel, Kenneth, or Frederick. It's just very basic, Sam, Ken, and Fred. And that's who we were. That's it with the name changes. Some folks use whitening creams. This may be more prevalent with women, as well as double eyelid surgeries. So whitening creams do exactly that, make your skin more fairer, because fairer skin, at least in East Asian culture, is viewed more highly because that might signify you lived indoors or belonged to a higher class, where those who had darker skin were out in the sun and obviously darker. There's a procedure known as double eyelid surgery where some Asians have what's known as a single slit, and it's very common. These surgeries are very common in South Korea. So folks would fly from all parts of the world and have what's known as a double eye surgery to look more Western or more attractive. Talked a little bit about being embarrassed of using my native Cantonese, but how about just being embarrassed by my culture altogether, right? Whether it's food or customs or anything related to my culture early on, I just wanted to minimize it and deny that was there. And obviously on the more extreme end, the impact of being an ethnic minority is the ever-present fear of not only discrimination, but on the extreme end, hate crimes. This is a picture of me in high school. I belonged to what was known as SCAA, the Seattle Chinese Athletic Association. It was during this time where I really started to develop an appreciation of who I was becoming as an Asian American. The reason why I say that, this is part of that encounter stage. I was finally meeting not only my own peers, but folks who are a generation older, like the coaches who are ethnic or had some ties to the ethnic community, and they looked like me, they talked like me, and they had college educations, they worked as teachers, in medicine, you name it. They were just regular folks. Whereas up until this point in time, most of the adults I knew were my parents' friends and relatives who were immigrants, didn't grow up in the system, the American system. So it was very hard to relate to my relatives and my relatives' peers. In the world of work, I realized race played a factor. There was a McDonald's down the street, so when I turned 16, I went in there, dressed really nicely, and applied to work there. I'm not sure if you would guess what happened, but I was not asked to come back. And I wondered to myself, was race a part of this? Now, you might be, depending on your own background, you're like, oh my gosh, Sam, are you being a little too sensitive here? Now follow along. This McDonald's at the time was 100% African American employed. The manager who interviewed me was black. All the employees were black. So at the time, even going into the interview, I knew that, oh my gosh, I'm different from everybody who works here. And he probably passed me up because I was different. Not necessarily saying he was racist, but maybe because he had never had any associations with Asian folks. What was he to hire me upon, right? There's no job reference where we had mutual friends. So it's all about comfort, and I can see why he didn't hire me, but at the same time it stuck in my head like maybe he didn't hire me because I wasn't black. So then I went to a car wash down the next city over, which was predominantly white. Everybody was white. A little ironic here. I had to take a psychological test here to be employed at the car wash. It was one of those weird ones where, like, have you ever stolen anything? Yes, no, yes, no. I probably failed the test miserably. Nevertheless, I didn't get hired here, and I wondered if it was because I wasn't white. Eventually, I did end up getting a job, and that was because my uncle gave me a reference to a Chinese grocery store. But that grocery store, once again, I didn't speak. My Chinese was not very good, so people kind of made fun of me when working there. In college, there's my roommate to the left. This is at Western Washington University in Bellingham. He belonged to the African American Alliance. I belonged to the Asian American Student Union. And I remember I had white friends who, they were kind of dismissive, like, where are you going and why are you going? And then they would joke that, oh my gosh, Sam, if we ever had something, like the white association, everybody be up in arms. And I never really understood that at the time because, I was just in my early 20s, but now that I reflect back on it, it's like, well, you guys have that everywhere. It's called American society. And the other piece is, this is the piece that I guess rubs me the wrong way. You don't have to be Asian or black to be a part of these associations. You just have to believe in the mission statement. And I think part of what we were trying to do is help each other navigate the minority experiences when it comes to being on campus, in college, the college experience of what does it mean to be a minority, but also what does it mean to go into fields that maybe our Asian parents would be against, and then at least you had peers that you could talk to and network with, and discuss ways to get some support. So unfortunately, my friends or my white friends didn't understand how that aspect came into play. My first career was working as a television news reporter. And depending on where I was working, my first jobs were in small cities such as Yakima, Washington, and Missoula, Montana. Then my sensitivity to being Asian and or ethnic stood out because I was the only ethnic person in the newsroom in a lot of these places. So what does that mean, being the only ethnic person? You may have heard that term, token Asian person or what have you, or token African American. And yeah, that's what it feels like, that you're just there to hit a quota. And then, so when you're hired, you're always wondering, or at least you have to try to prove people wrong, that, oh my gosh, did I get this because of merit, or are they hiring me because of my race? Obviously, race does play a role, but you can see how if you're white and you get a job in any company USA, you don't have to worry about people wondering if they hired you because of your race. So that's one piece to consider. When I moved to Toledo, Ohio, race was really becoming a factor because Toledo was very blue collar, industrial, a lot of union jobs, and there was a Toledo Jeep plant there. And so they made most of the country's Jeeps. And I remember in particular, if you worked there and you tried to park there, they had separate lots much farther down for those who drove imports. At the time, I think I drove a Honda around town. I just kind of wondered, oh my gosh, what are people going to think about me? And moving us to fast forwarding to today, I know I skipped a lot of years in between, became a therapist, went to grad school, so on and so forth, moved back home to the Seattle, Washington area. But xenophobia during the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of fear and hatred of people from different cultures, especially those from Asian backgrounds, being targeted. And, you know, I've had colleagues who said that they have friends in the neighborhood in the Seattle area where they have been targeted with racial epithets such as "go back to China," and it's been documented in the news where people have been assaulted. Even two boys were cut at a Walmart because of this. So I'm going to end this presentation with a spoken word poem that was triggered from Trump's comment when he called the coronavirus the Chinese virus, and how a lot of folks to this day still don't recognize that there are racial implications to calling a virus the Chinese virus. And this one is titled, A History of Complicity. You think I'm diseased, uncouth, the enemy. But if you looked in the mirror or deeper into your psyche, below the surface, unconscious bias, hatred, prejudices. Why? All because of outlandish stereotypes, caricatures, and lies. My reality denied to ease your guilt, your shame, your history of complicity in fostering racial hostility. Native Americans turned into Indians, seen as mascots for your entertainment. Blacks enslaved, and once considered just 3/5 human. Families raped, separated, generations later, communities segregated. Wiped clean from your conscience, out of sight, out of mind. Great Scott, you declare, it's their problem, separate but equal. No, that's not fair, and it's Dred Scott, to be clear, whom you denied freedom to one and to all. Fast forward to now, like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, whitewashing history to avoid your original sin. White flight, urban decay, joblessness. It's a facade to think your race has nothing to do with this. White privilege, an invisible shield to deflect any notion white skin plays a role amidst all this commotion. White fragility, also a weapon. You use tears, dejection, shame, as well as misdirection to obscure and to blame. You fail to take ownership of how this perpetuates a game of inequality, the game of life disguised as a field of dreams? But go ahead, spin the wheel, take 2 steps forward if you're white, everyone else go to the back. Oh, the horror of it all, to bring light to darkness, to focus not on black but on white. So you can hopefully see you are not innocent, you are not scot-free. History repeating itself, not with explicit slavery, but with subtlety, suspicion, and once again, white fragility. Sandwiched between slavery and civil rights, Asians come to America, seen as a race that won't fight. Instead, we're the easy scapegoat, the laughingstock, the punching bag for today's ills, the perpetual foreigner, the stranger, the ones viewed with the virus, the carriers infecting and killing. But not once have you considered what's your part in all this. Like a virus, you spread the fear, the vitriol, the hate. It's you who control the messages, the media, the movies that disseminate, racial divide, statistics that lie, names, narratives, and stories that hide, the social, educational, and political institutions that keep our country confused, conflicted, in a system of invisible racism that should be considered illegal and illicit, but only if you own up to it and see how you're still, to this day, ultimately complicit.